Now, the last time we spoke, you had COVID, but you were feeling well. Are you still feeling well, and have you no longer COVID?
I'm COVID-free and feeling very well, absolutely, George. Thank you for your concern, as ever.
Thank you. Now, look, Boris Johnson has had possibly the worst week of many bad weeks in his premiership. Just summarise how it all looks to you.
Well, you say it's one of the worst weeks. It feels very much so for the Prime Minister and his government. It's going from bad to worse. It just feels like the next morning we wake up, what other parties will we be hearing about? What other revelations will be coming out into the forefront of politics today? Obviously, this week has been ridden with party after party. I think it's more a case of let's talk about the days that there were not parties rather than the days there were parties, because there's been so many of them. But at the beginning, it seemed to be quite a farcical thing. Look at the government all boozing, drowning in booze day in, day out. But then it was really kind of encapsulated by the very image of the Queen herself sat on her own at her husband's funeral. And that's the image that really took the nation, because it really encapsulates exactly what people were doing at that time. They were sat on their own, maybe mourning loved ones, maybe just not able to see. Like myself, I couldn't go and visit my new nephew, my new niece, two of them during the COVID times. I couldn't go and visit my sister at that time. And many people, everybody in fact, has their own stories. But Boris Johnson and all of his chums, they seem to think, well, who cares? Even an hour after the government announced the rules, they were literally heading out, getting booze and going to the Downing Street parties. And that's the situation that the UK is in at the moment. It's party after party, revelation after revelation. And it really is, of course, as we've heard so many times, it's one rule for them and another for us.
There's only three possible explanations, isn't there, Shadia? One is that although they were trying to frighten the horses and the rest of us with the dangers of doing such things, they didn't really mean it. They knew it wasn't true, and that they were therefore safe to frolic in the corridors of power and in the gardens of power. Second is that they did believe their own propaganda, but were so stupid that they were prepared to risk the terrible outcomes that they had warned the rest of us against. And a third possibility is that these people are so drunk on power, so arrogant with power, that they think that they have the right to do as they please, and the rest of us have to do as they say, not do as their betters do. Which of these three, or is it a mixture of these three options, do you think?
It's certainly a mixture of the three, definitely, George. But the one that really stands out to me is option three. It's that arrogance. It's that hypocrisy. The apology we heard from Boris Johnson at PMQs on Wednesday, he said, I'm sorry if I upset you, essentially, not I'm sorry that I upset you. He says he takes responsibility for this. Now, if we look at the context of all of this, we've seen Allegra Stratton take responsibility, Matt Hancock take responsibility. They had to leave. So why is Boris Johnson not at that very podium saying that he will too leave as well? That's a really, really interesting way to look at it. He's saying he takes responsibility, but for what? He was really careful in what he was saying he was doing. It's more of, I'm so sorry to the public that you feel like this, but actually it was a work event. Now, I don't know what work event includes getting absolutely wasted to the point that you're damaging property, children's property in a garden.
Yeah, and trestle tables, groaning with the finest meats and wines. Well, maybe not the finest. They sent out in a suitcase for the booze. Although, to be fair, Boris Johnson was not at that particular party. He was actually recuperating in Chequers. It was only a few days after he himself came out of the ICU with COVID, which means that he has picked people to run his office and people for whom he's responsible, certainly for their conduct, who, while the boss was away knew that there would be no consequences for this drunken carousing.
Well, I just want to just take a phrase that you mentioned, fine wine. It's really interesting. Back in 2008, Boris Johnson he alleged that he found 100 bottles of fine wine that was left by his predecessor, Ken Livingstone, when he became the mayor of London. It's really interesting that he was trying to point the finger of blame at fine wine, and now his entire tenure is doused, is drowning, is drunk in these fine wine allegations. I think that's just a really ironic, let's say, point to make. But Boris Johnson, he allowed all of this to happen. We have to look into, when that email came out, invitation inviting 100 people. It wasn't a party plucked out of thin air. Boris Johnson knew what was going on. And in regards to a lot of these parties, he absolutely knew. We have to point the finger at blame directly at Boris Johnson. This is his government. What example is he setting, allowing all of this to go on at a time where people were absolutely locked away, and majority of people were really following the rules. And those that weren't following the rules, they were hit with really hefty fines. The other day I was looking on Twitter, and a lawyer that was representing a young boy, an 18-year-old lad, who invited a few of his friends. It turned into being a bit more than a few friends, but certainly less than 40 people, like the party at Downing Street. And he, an 18-year-old boy, was lumped with a fine of £10,000.
Wow.
So that's a huge, huge amount for an 18-year-old kid. Yes, that would be nothing for Boris Johnson, but he's the Prime Minister, and he needs to be held absolutely accountable. It's not just about him saying, I'm sorry, I take some sort of responsibility. He needs to be held to account. And I don't think Sue Gray's the woman that's going to do it, to be absolutely honest. We're hearing, let's wait for Sue Gray, let's wait for Sue Gray. Well, where the bloody hell is she? And when she does finally arrive and say what she has to say, it will take a lot more. People really need to hold him to account. MPs can do that. We've only seen 6 MPs come out to publicly speak against Boris Johnson and all of this booze culture. But the polls can also hold him to account. We have seen that somewhat, but it's going to take a bit more than this investigation. It will be important what she has to say, but this is the time. This will be the tide of change. Boris Johnson is on thin ice, and he's about to sink.
Well, I would say, disappointing though it may be, that he's probably past the worst. He could still sink, but I think he's safe until May, the local elections. If they go disastrously badly for the Conservatives, it's quite likely that he'll be removed, or to use a British Tory government phrase, highly likely that he will be replaced. But the fact that you need 54, is it, letters of no confidence to trigger a no confidence vote, I think it's a long, long way short of that, Shadia.
It is a long way, and we have to remember that Theresa May actually survived a vote of no confidence. So that still doesn't necessarily mean anything in either direction. And of course, if we look back at the last general election, Boris Johnson won with a huge majority, which was shocking to a lot of people, of course. But many people are still backing him. I don't know why, but that is certainly the case. So it still is a political labyrinth to sort of oust Boris Johnson, which is why I always look to see the momentum, the grassroots momentum, people on the streets. It will take a lot of people coming out against Boris Johnson. We've got to see an uproar now. It can't just be these enraged conversations at friends' houses. It's got to really manifest in some sort of political momentum to drive the change and drive Boris Johnson out. Because at the end of the day, a prime minister is only prime minister if there's some sort of political impetus to stay there. And I am a fan of people power, so that is what I would be advocating. And I certainly wouldn't be hoping for the Tory Party to bring Boris Johnson down, because I wouldn't trust them as far as I can throw them.
Quite so, but of course, if he is forced to resign, he'll be replaced by another Tory. And perhaps therein lies the reason why we're a long way short of achieving that. Because if you look at the Conservative front bench, And of course, it's the MPs that will be making this decision. But you're right, with public opinion in their mind, how could it be otherwise? They all have to face re-election in the end. But when people take a look around at people like Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak and so on, I suppose they ask themselves, are they likely to lead the Conservatives to victory at the next general election? If the answer to that is no, perhaps the instinct then is to cling to nurse for fear of something worse.
I have to definitely agree with that. For sure, we are looking at some pretty tragic cases, and a lot of people, the polls, they're not that big a fan of the likes of Priti Patel, Liz Truss, as you say. And so I do think that's why we haven't seen so many MPs publicly coming out to, Tories coming out to publicly condemn Boris Johnson, and they're sort of floating on the wayside, somewhat defending him, or at least hiding behind the Sue Gray investigation. We are looking, it's likely that we're going to see this investigation.
Who is Sue Gray, Shadia?
Who is Sue Gray?
Is she a real person?
Absolutely. My mother's name is Sue. And I said, are you Sue Gray, Mum? Are you Sue Gray? Who is Sue Gray? It's a very, very good question. And we'd never heard of her apart from this week, have we, George? And
but
so
the fate of the country is in our hands.
Absolutely. I think a lot of people think she is the answer, but it does take a lot more than what she says. Of course, it will be an important moment. I would like to think she would do the right thing, but we have to remember the person that was in her position before her, he had to stand down because he was found to be at a party himself. So it's not really looking too good either.
Who knew there was so much partying going on in Downing Street amongst such odd people who'd want to be at a party they held? Shadia Edwards-Dashti, as always, I'd love to be at a party with you, but that's as far as it goes. Shadia, thank you so much for joining us on the mother of all talk shows.